All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our event, Our World, Indigenous Communities in Solidarity for Environmental Justice as part of SCECon 2021, Our Time, Our World, Our Time, Our Voices. My name is Jed. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm one of your moderators today, along with my co-facilitator, Sophia. Today, our panelists will be sharing their experiences as Indigenous leaders of environmental justice around the world, working with their communities to advocate for their tribal communities. There are three incredible partners supporting today's event. First is the Student Environmental Resource Center, SCEC, an environmental hub on UC Berkeley's campus, dedicated to providing environmental and social justice resources and programming through its values of student sovereignty and bold imagination.
Next is the Native American Student Development Center at Berkeley. NASD exists to serve and support the diverse and changing needs of Native students in their time at Cal. The office strives to provide relevant, accessible, and engaging programs and resources, as well as promote intertribal and cross-cultural approaches to community building with a social justice lens. We work to partner with both on and off-campus entities to provide students with the best experience possible in their time here, while also supporting continuing growth and understanding of their individual identities as Native people. We also work to bring the histories, experiences, and worldviews into a valued realm within the university as a whole.
And lastly, this event is hosted by the Students of Color Environmental Collective at UC Berkeley as part of the Students of Color Environmental Conference 2021, an environmental justice-centered conference hosted by students of color for students of color. This conference is funded by the Green Initiative Fund. Our theme this semester is Our World, Our Time, Our Voices, as we aim to recenter the environmental narrative around environmental justice by giving intentional space for students of color to learn about unique and intersectional environmental topics and to share our own view of environmentalism. Our conference is focused on democratizing environmental education through engaging panels and workshops.
Today, we are so excited to bring all our amazing panelists from all over the world together for this important conversation. We would like to give a huge thanks to all the panelists for taking the time to join us today and share their experiences and stories. We are so honored to be in your presence and learn from your wisdom and experience. Before we start, we want to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huchun, the land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. As members of the Berkeley community, we continue to benefit from the usage of this stolen land. The hashtag Land Back movement makes it imperative that we better understand the history of this land and that the members of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band are still present within the Berkeley community. We are honored to have Deja Gould from the Sogorea Land Trust do a welcome blessing before the beginning of our panel.
Hello, sorry. Horshatruhi Kanakrakat Deja Gould Akoy Hemanya. Hello everyone, my name is Deja Gould. Welcome to everyone. I am a representative for the Confederated Villages of Lashawn and the Sogorea Land Trust. I just wanted to welcome everyone today virtually to the territory of Huichin, the traditional territory of my people. We have an unbroken tie to these lands since the beginning of time. And this looks like such an amazing panel today. And I hope that you've all learned a lot. And yeah, welcome and blessings.
Thanks so much to Deja and the Sogorea Land Trust for that powerful blessing. Now I will go over our agenda for this event. First, we will have a brief introduction to the concepts of environmental justice, climate change, and the need for Indigenous leadership. Next, we will introduce our panelists and then jump into our moderated Q&A session. After, we will answer questions from the audience. You can submit questions to our panelists through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please ask clear and specific questions and avoid using overly technical or academic language in order to be more inclusive. Finally, we will be having a brief closing. Now, Jed will start off with the brief presentation.
Thank you, Sophia. Now that we know that your attendance today probably means that you're passionate about environmentalism and furthering your understanding of environmental justice, we wanted to provide some brief definitions so we can all be on the same page, regardless of your knowledge level. First, I wanted to define environmental justice using the definition from the 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. The preamble to their 17 environmental justice principles reads, a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of their lands and communities, reestablishing our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth, respecting and celebrating each of our cultures, languages, and beliefs about the natural world and our roles in healing ourselves, promoting economic alternatives which would contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and securing our political, economic, and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our peoples. Next, we recognize that climate change is caused by capitalism's extractive culture of overconsumption, rooted in colonization and imperialism as defined in the last slide. In 2018, the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, reported that the world has 12 years to prevent 1.5 degree Celsius warming and to stop irreversible climate change. And we're in 2021 now, so that's even closer. Climate change threatens our world systems and exacerbates inequities surrounding natural disasters, food, water, sanitation, housing, transportation, war and conflict, and more.
Indigenous folk worldwide are disproportionately impacted by the climate change. The destruction and taking of land also means the destruction and loss of their homes. Indigenous people, less than 5% of populations, manage over 25% of land and support over 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous people hold the solutions to climate change and extractive capitalism. Non-Indigenous people must follow and uplift the leadership of Indigenous climate activists. Radical solidarity, especially in the global context, is so important. It is for this reason we wanted to put on this event and to bring our panelists from around the world to be in conversation together. We are blessed to learn from them today.
The first of our panelists is Hindu Omaru Ibrahim. Hindu is an environmental activist and member of Chad's pastoralist Marbaro community, a UN Sustainable Development Goal advocate and Conservation International Senior Fellow. Hindu began advocating for Indigenous rights and environmental protection at age 16, founding the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, or AFPAT, to introduce new income revenue activities for women and collaborative tools such as 3D participatory mapping to build sustainable ecosystem management and reduction of nature-based resource conflicts. Her vision is to grow support for both traditional knowledge and science and to improve resilience to climate change, especially for rural communities.
Then we have Lydia Louisa Jennings. Lydia is both Pascua Yaqui, also known as Yoeme, and Huichol, also known as Werekuta. Lydia earned her Bachelor's of Science from California State University, Monterey Bay in Environmental Science, Technology, and Policy. Lydia earned her doctorate in the Department of Environmental Sciences with a minor in American Indian Policy. Her research interests are in environmental remediation, Indigenous science, mining policy, and Indigenous data sovereignty. Today, Lydia works on the unceded traditional homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and Pascua Yaqui tribe as a postdoctoral researcher in community environment and policy at the University of Arizona.
Next, Tiana Yakichevich of Ngati Kuhununu, Kita Waiora, Tefak in Tuhiaya, Nai Tuhoi, and Croatian descent, is an Indigenous Maori woman from Aotearoa. Tiana is an interdisciplinary advocate and activist who champions for the protection of intergenerational, environmental, social, and cultural justice within her community and internationally at the United Nations as a member of Te Ara Watu. Tiana has a background in advocating for marginalized and minority students within a university context. She sits on faculty boards and the university's governance board as a Penn Ultimate Law and Arts student.
Our last panelist is Molly Olekwanga, is a Laikipia Maasai, the founder and director of Organization for the Survival of Laikipia Maasai Indigenous Group Initiatives that translate to hope in Maasai. Osi Ligi later transformed into Impact, Indigenous Movement for Peace, Advancement, and Conflict Transformation, an organization that exists to organize, build, and strengthen Indigenous peoples' social movements in Kenya. He has worked with WIPO on issues of Maasai cultural heritage and UNESCO on Indigenous traditional knowledge and climate change. He has published articles on different journals in the areas of Indigenous traditional knowledge, Indigenous peoples, and urbanization, Indigenous peoples' education, and militarization of Indigenous peoples' lands.
Please give us a big welcome in welcoming all of our panelists. We're so excited and honored for y'all to be here today. Thank you for being here. So we're going to start off with the moderated Q&A now. So this question is for all panelists, and I will be prompting y'all to answer in a specific order. But the first question is, expanding on the definition provided in that introduction, what does environmental justice mean to you? What do you want people to know about environmental justice? What does justice mean or look like for the communities you work with? And it should be placed in the chat as well, but if Molly, if you wanted to go first, and then we'll have Tiana, Lydia, and Hindu in that order.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here, and greetings from Kenya. Yes, I think environmental justice, environment and justice. Environment, in nature, our mother, I mean, the provisions, providers, is providence. It's an issue about the trees, about the land and all that, and the totality. And if justice is also a question about being fair in what we do. It's a right issue. It's a question of enabling, it's inclusivity. It's a question of about broadening the space for everyone. So how it connects is the industrialized world, which is a consumer-driven world. It's actually pushing the world towards the brink of collapse. So when you talk about environmental justice, in the reality, you're talking about treating the environment as a being, see, because it's a being. In my tribe, the Maasai, land has name. Trees have purpose. You know, they have. We are talking about medicine from the trees. So when you treat when you treat the environment badly, it treats us badly. So what we say about justice, we need to treat the environment. The current generation has to treat and manage the environment for purposes of the future generations. So it's a question about intergenerational justice for me and for my people. So that's exactly for how it treats the environment is us, and we are the part of the environment, and we need to give it, to treat it nicely, to treat it, to give it the sanctity it deserves, so that it can give us the services which we are doing right now.
Thanks, Molly. Tiana, if you'd like to answer next.
Sure. Kia ora, everybody. My name is Tiana. I am calling in from Aotearoa, otherwise known as New Zealand. In terms of environmental justice, what I think first is Indigenous sovereignty, is putting Indigenous peoples first and recognizing like their rights as tangata whenua, as the people of the land, as the people that are first going to be impacted. In terms of what this like translates to for like my community, I would say that like environmental justice encompasses everything. So we have the saying, ko au ko te whenua, ko au, ko te awa, ko au. So I am the land and the land is me. I am our rivers and the rivers are me. And that doesn't directly translate as to we are the land. What that means is that our health and our well-being is intrinsically tied to the health and well-being of our environments. So if our rivers are polluted, if our land is like increasingly being degraded, then of course the health and well-being of our people is going to be, second class as well. So environmental justice is like reparation, land back, all of the above. Yeah.
Thanks, Tiana. Lydia, you'd like to answer next?
Hi, and so I just want to introduce myself quickly in my language, Loas and Shaniva Nepo Lydia. And so I'm Lydia, and I'm here on the traditional lands of the Thanatam Nation in Tucson, Arizona, and also where my tribe, the Pasquayaki, reside. And so when I think about environmental justice, it's very similar to Tatiana in terms of thinking about Indigenous sovereignty and thinking about much more broadly, the idea of our communities and Indigenous peoples have the right to make decisions about our lands, our people, our water, and also as a scientist, thinking about the data that's collected about our communities and the types of questions that are asked. So is it something that's serving our community, or is it serving a researcher and being very extractive in that process? And so when I think about environmental justice, it's inherently linked to social justice. And it's important that we recognize as Native people, we're not going to be on the table. We're going to be at the table or creating our own through sovereignty, through policies, through consultation. But also recognizing that this importance of intersectionality, both of people and of our non-human kin. So when we have mining coming into a community, it inherently impacts Indigenous women differently. In part because you're bringing in large populations of men. I'm sure many of you have heard about man camps and thinking about something like the Dakota Access Pipeline, but even a lot of different types of mines. It brings a large influx of men. Many Native nations have kind of restrictive policies, at least in the United States, about how you can try a non-tribal member for something like domestic or sexual abuse. That's something that we continue to work on through the Violence Against Women Act. But recognizing those challenges, there's also, those challenges of different coloration of Indigenous peoples and of trans community members. So really recognizing within this environmental justice, the social justice, and this intersectionality of all these other issues. Again, in more of the environmental respect, thinking about our access to clean air, to water, to land, our access to food systems, healthcare, housing, and access to education. And then also having the ability to express discomfort in certain policies or where certain projects go, and really being able to make an impact on the outcome. And so again, this is why as an environmental scientist, I might study these environmental issues, but they're inherently linked to understanding sovereignty and policy and federal Indian law. And then lastly, I think all of us are doing this type of work because we want to know our family and our community are safe. And not only safe now in the present, but also in the future, and thinking those 7 generations forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. And Hindu, if you'd like to answer.
Sure, thank you, Jet Li, and hi everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be with all of you here, and especially to be with the panelists there. So for me, environmental justice and for my community, I think it's not different than what my brother and the sister said here. So let me give you an example of how I'm feeling or how we are living environmental justice or injustice, we can say. I am coming from a nomadic pastoralist community. So my people's still, most of them moving from one place to another one with the cattle to found water and pastures. So that means during the dry season, we can go up to 1,000 kilometers. So just like walking by the feet after the cattle and then going to the water place, going to the pasture place. And then during the rain season, we stop from one place to another one. So we can go transboundary way. So for us, what is the meaning of environment first? So my peoples just like get impacted or divided by the colonization, because my direct communities are coming from Chad, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, Central African Republic. So all those 5 or 6 countries around, so I do not say just to my community, I say that my direct relative, like my uncle from my father, my auntie from my mother, so all of them, they are in a different country now. So they own like Cameroonian passports, other on like Nigerian passports, other on Niger passports, and I do have the Chadian passport. So the colonization come and cut us. This for me, the first environmental injustice, because we belong to the land, we belong to the territory where we are getting our food, our survival there. And then that's the first one, they cut us from our environment. And then they limit us, we have to move from one country to another one by presenting paper and having all the bureaucracy behind. So then for me, when we talk about the environmental justice, we do not need to talk just about the frontiers. It have to talk beyond the frontiers. It have to take the big repair, like the rivers. The rivers, we depend from it. The lakes, we depend from the lake. The pastures, we depend from it. The forests, all those natural resources come together for the humanity, must be cherished and treated it in an equal way with the respect of this nature. So that's what my community not to do better, because when we move from one place to another one, we are helping the ecosystem to get regenerated in a natural way. So that means we are respecting, giving justice to this environment and protecting it. And for my community, what is the meaning of environmental justice? It is when we live from one place, we get the pastures that we need. We get the water that we need. And then we share these resources with the rest of the animals. As all of you know, in Africa, and especially in the savannas and the tropical forests where we are living, we have a lot of diversity of the animals, of the birds, of the insects, and that makes the environment very diverse. So we know how to keep balance with this nature. And suddenly, all this climate change and all this loss of biodiversity, industrialization, as Sister Lydia said, come and change all this and create the injustice for our peoples and create the injustice for my community. And then we have to struggle to get just access to these normal resources that we have. So environmental justice, it's really very important for the survival of our peoples as indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we will be going to the next question, and this is also for everyone. What motivated you and brought you into this work? What does your day-to-day work look like? So we will start this time with Hindu, and then we will go to Lydia, then Tiana, then Molly. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so what motivates me to do this work? I think not just like I am motivating to fight for environment or for climate, no. I think as an indigenous person, you already born motivated, because I born in this community who have to fight every single day to get access to the clean water, to get access to the land. My people's always fighting to have them on land protected. So this is a big motivation that I born on it and I grow up on it. So how I start my work, because in my peoples, there is no chance to go to the Western education. So I got a very exceptional mother who get the chance to send me to school. So when she sent me to school at that time, I got two marginalization. When I go to the school, I get marginalized by the kids at the school. They don't want to sit next to me. They say like, oh, I'm coming from a rural communities, the indigenous communities, I'm smiling milk. I mean, you do not smile milk because you just own cattle. So they marginalize me. When I go back to my community, they say like, oh, this is the city girl, she go to the school. So then at the end of the day, so you have just like to fight as children, you have to fight for your own right in the both sides. So my mom say like, she get a challenge. She has to take me to the communities and learn all what my peoples are doing. And then I have to also learn how to read and write, because it is very important for me to get integrated in this new society. So that's helped me when I become a teenager to understand that I'm so lucky, because I know how the other people's treating me. And I say how they can treat the other girls in my community who do not get the chance to go to school. I have to stand and fight for them rights. And immediately I understood I cannot fight for them human rights without fighting for the community rights, because we have a collective rights. And then when I say like, oh, I have to think about the community, I understood again, I cannot talk about human rights without talking about the environment rights, because we live and depend from the environment. The healthy of our environment, it is our healthy. So if we are healthy, also we protect our environment. So immediately that's helping me to set up the two goals: protection and promotion of human rights, indigenous people rights, and protection of the environment. And then when I started doing that at the local level with my community, I saw at the international level, people are setting the wording, the technical wording, as Sophia said earlier in the introduction, on the term. They say like climate change, they say biodiversity, they say desertification. So that's come the 3 Rio conventions that come at the international level in 1992, where they wanted to protect the environment. And I attended the first meeting, it was in 2000 in New York, that was the international one. And when I hear people talking about that, I'm like, what are you talking about? You do not know what you're talking about. It is not a wording. You can never separate biodiversity. You can never separate climate change. You can never separate a desertification. So it is not like you just to cut a square mile, so you say, I protect this biodiversity, I protect this climate change. In the reality, all our environment is integrated. So we need to protect all together. And then I said, I have to follow this international level and translate that at the national level in order to make a bridge. So that's how I build my project, my peoples, to do the real project in the ground and to take the history at the international level in order to influence what is going on and tell them they are wrong. They have to respect our rights. They have to protect us. They have to protect all the land in the collective way in order to solve the environmental issue.
Great, thank you, Hindu. Next, we will go to Lydia.
Ooh, Hindu's a hard one to follow up. So I think generally when I think about what brought me to this work, it's been a long, meandering river to achieve this point. When I say generally, you know, I'm a really avid trail runner, and so it wasn't uncommon when I was younger, and even now coming back to Arizona for grad school, to run across old abandoned mines and kind of talk to family and community members about these mines, both in New Mexico and Arizona, and kind of how they're here, but it's not something that's common in other places. So I think that was a really core part of that as well. But then when I started school, really in undergrad, and I saw so many people focusing just on the science, but I always made the connection of thinking about my own family history, my grandparents working in agricultural fields, you know, learning about friends, families who are working in mines, and just really understanding how much mining has impacted Native communities very disproportionately to other segments of the population. And then also, you know, while I was an undergrad, seeing so many of my friends who weren't in school, who were at the front lines of protest and being arrested at early ages to protect their sacred ecosystems. And even how something like the National Environmental Policies Act, which is kind of an environmental policy here, some communities were starting to teach that to middle schoolers to really understand this major legal pathway and how uncommon that was for other communities. So I think because mining is such a big issue there. So I think those all started to plant seeds. And when I finished up my undergrad, I worked for several years as an environmental toxicologist for UC Davis. And that allowed me to go out and sample all these major rivers and soil samples. And I kept on seeing the communities that were most impacted by pesticides or, you know, chemical pollutants were those that were closest proximity to Brown and Indigenous communities, whether that be farm working families or near reservations, that always, or even urban communities, that always really stood out to me, and I wanted to understand why. And so as I came back home for a summer to really think about what was next, it was also interesting and powerful to talk to elders, both in my family and my friends' families, and how they're having these conversations about losing access to food collection areas, or losing access to ceremonial lands. And really them telling these stories about how the land is changing, even just getting less moisture. And so that's really what helped me decide to go into environmental microbiology for my PhD. And it's really thinking about mining as this big issue that impacts us as the Sonora Desert. And in my first year, I felt like it was very much validated, as there are 3 major mine spills happening in that first year. One is the Cananea mine spill, which happened in Mexico, impacted my tribe's community in Mexico, in the Rio Yaqui area, that which people are still not able to farm from that river area anymore because it's been contaminated from heavy metals. Also, the Gold King mine spill happened that year, which really impacted our Dene relatives up north in northern Arizona. And then lastly, the Mount Poli mine spill that happened up in British Columbia, and really impacting a lot of the communities there, particularly those who are dependent on salmon fisheries. And they actually had salmon washing up on the shore without any skin because of the heavy metals in the river system. So I think all of those are really important aspects of really thinking about this work, and how can we use science as a way of solution, but also inherently understanding why these mines are happening so disproportionately in close proximity to Indigenous populations.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Next, we will be going to Tiana.
Sure. So my journey into environmentalism, I guess, as an Indigenous person, like we have this phrase and saying that we are the kaitiaki, we are the guardians and protectors. And kaitiakitanga, is an act, like it's a physical act that means that you have a duty to protect the land. And not only that, but we don't own the land. We are the guardians of the land. So our concepts of ownership and our concepts of like human trusteeship, these have been going on since forever and will go on for forever. So we have this saying like, you are your mokopona's only hope and your ancestors' wildest dreams. So what that means is like we have to, mokopuna are your grandchildren, so we have to look after our environment for the next 7 generations. And at the moment, we don't have a concept of past and present in Māoridom. So what we say is we are the ancestor in present form. And so in terms of coming into environmental justice, I think that kind of started at school when we were learning about histories, and I was really fortunate to grow up on my whenua where my tribal lands are and connected to my mara and my river, etc., etc. And like learning our colonial history is completely different from Indigenous background versus colonial background. At school, you're not taught what colonization is. You're not taught the effects that this has on people. You're not even taught like what human rights or Indigenous rights are. Indigenous rights should be like above human rights. We can't have human rights without Indigenous rights. They're inherently interconnected. And so what really brought me into environmental justice, environmental work, is going back home. Every time I'd go back home, would have a freak storm, would have a flood. We actually had to excavate my urupa, so one of my cemeteries, because of river degradation. It was learning that in 40 years, we're probably going to be underwater. And then it's just learning the interconnectedness, so our whanaunga in the Arctic, their ice is melting and our waters are rising. So like how interconnected we are as Indigenous peoples. And so my day-to-day work, well, I'm currently a penultimate law and arts student, so kind of studying, but also on the side of that, I'm in like my environmental work kind of happens every day. We have this process of like hosting and holding wānanga, which are kind of like workshops, kind of like circles of spaces where we have our kaumatua, our elders, and we have our youngers to try and figure out what the issues are, how we're going to tackle them, what does mana motuhake, what does self-determination mean, and how are we actually going to action that. So that's what my day-to-day involves. And that often means, like, we're quite fortunate for one of my places, like one of my Tuanga Waiwai ancestral stomping grounds is protected under legal personhood. So Tuirueta, which is like a rainforest, is completely is known as its own legal entity, which means that, you know, it's come out of being a national park, which is like our land stolen and then put under a crown entity, and now it's come back into legal personhood, which means it's its own entity, it's its own person in the eyes of the law. So, you know, it's able to be protected. So we're kind of figuring out, okay, what does legal personhood mean in terms of acting as a kaitiaki, acting as the guardian and protected, like, who can we prevent from taking our water? Who can we prevent from, you know, nitrates in the water, that kind of thing. Yeah, but that's kind of what that all means to me.
Thank you, Tiana. And then lastly, we'll be going to Molly.
Thank you very much for the enriching kind of how we came to this space. For me, being a pastoralist, more my livelihood and that of the Maasai, just like what Hindu I just said about the nomadic tribes. Maasai in East Africa could have been the only tribe or the only nation that signed an agreement with the British colonial government. So I discovered this earlier when I went to a boarding school run by the Catholics. And in my family, I was the only one who was not sponsored to school because I refused to go to church. But I started, that's in my primary school, and I started knowing and asking myself, why do we need as a people, as Maasai, to be sponsored to go to school? But I came to realize that through history, the way history is posed in school, how the Maasai signed two major agreements, or treaties actually, they're not agreements, treaties with the British colonial government. And it was really painful because that's how the Maasai lost much of their land, more or less like how the natives, the native tribes in the US, the Maori, and also perhaps in Canada, lost their land. So much of the Maasai belonged to Kenya, and then they were pushed to different, they were fragmented, they lost their power as a community. They are now more or less like different territories. This contributed a lot to social marginalization, and this is exactly the reason why we lost land. And when during holidays, when we were looking after cows with my father, one time we got arrested because my father was arrested because of trespassing. So now he got into a white man's land, and this thing kept disturbing me, and that's how I started writing articles in newspapers in my high school. And then I continued writing articles, but I found that that's not the only way. In college, I went into activism to address all these issues about major factors that affect Maasai and how the Maasai are being discriminated. And also addressing the old question about how they lost the land. Up to right now, we are still dealing with this issue about the 1904 and 1911 treaties, where Maasai lost a major part of the land, and the land went with the heritage. When land goes, it goes with the heritage, it goes with the identity, it goes with the land is the heart, and the cow is the soul. So that's this how really I got into this, and it's become part of my life. My life is a struggle, as Lindu says, a struggle between promoting collective harmony within my people, but also continuously engaging questions about discrimination. It's issues to do with issues about exclusion, and also the question about continuously fighting for identity. Because if you look in the whole of Kenya and Tanzania, Most of the places are named after the Maasai. Nairobi is a Maasai name, and all the other major cities. These are, and nobody acknowledges this, that this was a territory of the Maasai. These are, so we are fighting for culture, we are fighting for identity, we are fighting for the land. And one of the major reasons why we are poor because land was taken forcefully from us. And so how does it look? In my day-to-day? It's a struggle. To run and organize social movement, it's a struggle. I think my sister Indu will tell you how much it is a struggle to actually just raise money to organize people or to put to facilitate community empowerment or community organizing platforms in a community. It's a whole challenge. So you're struggling to hold up your family. You're struggling to continuously ensure that the community is working towards liberating. And these are the old questions about why we fight, because we are being overloaded by the colonized environment. So we really have to continuously fight for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your powerful stories. That is so much appreciated. And I will pass this on to Jed.
Thanks, Sophia, and thanks everyone. It was really powerful to hear everyone's story, and I feel like I'm hearing a common thread of how it is such, this work, and from the past two questions, this work and your concepts of environmental justice are born out of necessity and born out of the deep connections to your land and your community and to yourself, and that the events of the past from your ancestors of colonization and current events and, like, for example, like natural disasters all impact and influence your work. So we really love to hear this, and want to keep digging deeper and finding intersections and common threads between all of your stories, because they're so important. So now we're going to be going a little deeper and asking each panelist specific questions related to the work, and trying to keep building conversation and finding new intersections. So this first question is for Lydia. So you've done extensive research on mining and mining reclamation when getting your PhD. Could you speak to how your research shows that mining and other Indigenous issues transcend borders and affect us all globally?
Yeah, this is going to be kind of a long answer because it's a lot. But first, I want to just define what reclamation is. So reclamation is really the process of rebuilding the land and establishing plant vegetation after it's been destroyed to extract metals of interest. In our case, it's copper. And we live in the Sonoran Desert, where actually 80% of copper metals are extracted from. And within that, 40% of mines are on or bordering tribal nations. So figuring out how to heal the land as quickly as possible in an area that's relatively dry and windy is really important and can be really challenging. I think it's also really important when we have these conversations that Indigenous communities in the United States have often been viewed as resource colonies. In fact, there's federal policy from the 1930s and 40s that really call them as resource extraction colonies. And so in that process, in that federal viewpoint of mining on tribal lands, tribal nations have been underpaid, underemployed, even though employment is often a big point of companies trying to engage with tribal communities. And also tribal nations continue to carry the environmental burden of the general United States development. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because it's not just happening in the United States, it's also happening globally. Before I go into this global connection, I also just want to make a caveat point that some tribes have chosen to invest in mining projects, most notably the Crow Nation, the Navajo Nation, and it's their sovereign right to make that decision for their community. But it's also important that we acknowledge the role of colonization and capitalism have played in influencing those communities' decision-making processes. So now as I go in thinking about these global implications, most major mining companies are transnational. So it's changed a lot from, the early 1800s when it was a few families who were going out and prospecting. Now mines are huge. They're very large pits, type of mining styles, and they're transnational. And so what happens in one country affects how Indigenous communities are treated and affected in another country. And also, I think that's important because it also tells us about how mining companies might be behaving in, let's say, a very prime example is a mining company and how they operated in Australia, and they actually blew up some of their I believe the Maori sacred caves there. Now they're wanting to do a mining company here in Southern Arizona. But our communities and our community organizers have been looking at watching those and looking at how do they engage or not engage with the Indigenous peoples of those places they worked prior, and how are they thinking about human rights and environmental rights. And so it's really important that we continue to watch and learn from one another's strategies of how to engage in this, and if it can be done respectfully and sustainably. I think that's a question that many tribal nations continue to have. The other part I think that's so important is I'm talking to you today from Zoom. I'm highly dependent on my cell phone, and really thinking about the power of these metals that so much of us are dependent on, and how we invest in electronics. Even solar energy requires extraction of these heavy metals that are land intensive and water intensive. And now we also know human rights intensive. And so it's really important to think about our purchasing power as consumers, but also it's compounded, at least in my view, it's compounded by the fact that if we in the United States are the primary consumer of these metals, don't we also carry that burden of caring, of having to be responsible for the majority of these mines? And if we're not extracting here, are we essentially exporting our pollution to other parts of the world where they might not have the same level of environmental protection or human right protections? So it often comes to the question of where do we extract? Who should carry that environmental burden? And how do we not carry out environmental colonization to other Indigenous peoples in the world? And that's something I have struggled with throughout my PhD and continue to think about deeply, because all of us want to protect our sacred ecosystems that we have family connection to, but so do our relatives in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And so I think that is something really thinking much more deeply about, and is why I've gone into the aspect of studying reclamation, and in some cases working with the mining companies to really understand their challenges and how can we do this responsibly if that's possible.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And I know you brought up that point of like this common thread that even Tiana, Hindu, and Molly have all brought up of interconnectivity, and how like mining companies are transnational, and how this affects everyone, no matter where you are. And these are affecting Indigenous communities in every part of the world. So
can I just add one thing? Sorry. And I also just want to address too of how climate change is impacting all of these projects. So some of those big mine failures that I talked about in pollution, that's also being compounded by the fact of climate change. And we're having the 10,000-year floods followed by big droughts. So it makes repairing these ecosystems challenging. And it makes also our communities and thinking about traditional foods also challenged. So thank you.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for adding that, Lydia. Next, we will be going on to Hindu, and this question's for Hindu. So we'll, you served as the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change during the historic United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris. Could you talk about your experience organizing on the international level? How does it differ from localized community work?
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. This is a incredible questions and also memory, because you are making me just think about all this process. So I will try to summarize because it's really 2 years of work. So when I have been nominated as the co-chair of the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change, it was in the preparation COP, the COP20 in Lima. So that was the beginning of how we make our strategy as Indigenous peoples. And it was the second week. And when the country start discussing how they are going to organize the COP, so we were discussing how we are going to organize our 7 socio-cultural regions. And then luckily, we have the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change have a global steering committee. So 2 peoples from each regions that formed 14 peoples who supposed to inform them regions about what is happening on the climate change and what is the negotiation are formed and are discussed. So we got funding support from Norway. And they don't want to give us the direct funding to us to manage it. So they pass it through UN. Of course, as usual, they wanted to babysitting us, and then they don't want to give us the full responsibility. So when they give it to the UN, UNDP, and then they started, the first thing I remember to negotiate this one was they can support the developing country Indigenous peoples. And then I come no, that cannot work. If you support the 7 regions of Indigenous peoples in an equitable way. Indigenous peoples in developed countries are also marginalized and discriminated like my people who are in developing country. It is not the issue that some of them get the chance to go to school, or of course, like Lydia has a PhD and then you have to apply that to all the community. It is not true. And luckily, again, because I visited some Indigenous peoples in US, in Canada, in Australia. So I went to those countries. I mean, in Arctic regions, I saw the Indigenous peoples in developed countries. And I saw how they are also living, how they are also excluded and threatening. Even if you have access to the electricity or internet, it is not the development that the peoples have. So that was the first fight. You have to give the money to all the 7 regions in an equitable way. So it was very hard for them. But I said, if you cannot give this money, you walk away with your money. And then they cannot walk away because they get the money from the parliament and all the commitment with all the political issues, they have to just accept it. So that was done. So second was how we can convince to share all the Indigenous peoples to get prepared. We do not have a government structure. Each community has his own governance, have his own protocol of how approaching peoples. So then we decentralize that from the regional level, people choose some country to do the experience of how we can gather our needs. So I give you the example of my country. I went to several communities. I discussed with them about what is the COP. Of course, I'm not going to tell them this is the COP or whatever. I said there is a meeting about the environment that will be organized, and they're going to come up with a document and whatever. So in my community, they come with, they wanted to have all this discussion be right-based approach. Secondly, they say they wanted to have the gender issues is there because women are playing a big role. And then they say they also wanted to have our knowledge are respected. So then I take all this recommendation. I came at the national level. I organized a lunch with the minister. I invite him and I invite the technical team. I present to them the recommendation. I say, if you are going to prepare the NDCs, the national determined contributions, who will prepare Paris, it has to include what community need. Otherwise, you are out of all this. And luckily that the minister hear from me, and the national determined contribution of Chad include all those 3 aspects. So most of the regions have some national experiences. And then we had a regional gathering. So for Africa, we have it in Nairobi with my brother Ole. So when we gather there, we come up with what the national level said. And then the 7 regions come together at the international meeting in Bonn. So when we come there, all the regions agree on 4 needs. So we need that the outcome recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, to recognize that the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, to recognize the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples, and the finance must be directed to the Indigenous peoples because we are the one who building the solution. So we agree on our 4 messages, And then we moved to the political strategy. The political strategy was, I have to organize meeting between indigenous peoples and some friendly state. So we call them friendly state because there are some countries from Latin America, from Africa, some of them who understand the issue of indigenous people and who push them. So we call them friendly state. So we have the meeting with them 2 times. And then we present to them our needs. And when you present it, you have to be very strategic, not just like present the 4 items that we want. So you have to look at the negotiation text. You say, this item, I wanted to have it in this agenda. I wanted to have it after this sentence. So we make them understand. And then during the 2 weeks of negotiations, it was really the hard one in my life. Of course, like the second also was after the parties. So I come in the morning, I go back like at 5 a.m. sometimes without eating because I got sick after that. Why I'm doing that? So of course we do not negotiate as indigenous peoples, but we have to talk those who are negotiating. So I have meeting with ministers, with country delegate, and then I have like to found all the network to have meeting with presidents. So what make it work, I get meet many presidents as head of state, presenting to them what we need as indigenous peoples and telling them that have to come out, otherwise your results are not going to work. If you say indigenous people protect 80% of the world biodiversity, so we have to be the players on the decision, otherwise it will be no outcome. So then we passed through all this. The last night was so stressful, very, very stressful. So we do not have any paper that's showing what is the outcome. And then we were there until 1 a.m., just like waiting if it's coming back or not. And then that was the strength of the indigenous women. Sorry, Ole, I'm not criticizing indigenous man, but all the indigenous men left the negotiation room. So it was only the indigenous women who was there. And there was one of our elder from US who was also sitting with us. So we stayed there until 2 a.m. when they come and read it. And we figure out the indigenous rights come out, indigenous participation come out, indigenous knowledge come out, but just they reject, I mean, not they rejected, but nothing about the finance directed to indigenous peoples. So we end up with the 5 references. But that was a big win after 20 years of negotiation, but it was also a beginning of the struggle because we are still fighting for the implementation of those 5 references in the equitable way, but it is so hard. But I'm so proud of this outcome with all the brothers and sisters from the different regions.
Wow, what a story. Thank you so much, Hindu. I definitely, the point that you brought up about how this issue is global, and even, you know, there are differences in, like, you know, historically colonized nations and colonizer nations, but indigenous people throughout the whole world are marginalized and, you know, face these issues. So I definitely see that intersection and see that global need for solidarity. And just like in my classes, like learning about the UN sounds very stressful and hard. So it's just amazing to hear your work. So thank you for sharing. So next question is for Tiana. You are part of Te Ara Watu and have advocated for your community both internationally and locally. Could you speak to your experience with Te Ara Watu as well as a student activist studying law and arts?
Sure. So I will start with explaining what Te Ara Watu is. So Te Ara Watu, so I'll break it into what it means. So Ara is means wake up. It means the morning. It's like a consensus of the collective, and Watu means to bridge. So Te Ara Watu as a meaning kind of means to bridge the connected or the woven path. And Te Ara Watu is a collective of rangatahi youth from Aotearoa and the Pacific. Aotearoa, New Zealand is actually in a really interesting place where we house the largest diaspora of Pacific people. So we house more Samoan and Tongan people in Aotearoa than actually live back in their islands. So our Indigenous population, while we have Māori as tangata whenua, we also acknowledge that the Pacific Islands are our tuakana, are our elders in terms of the Pacific nation. So Te Ara Whatu is a collective of both tangata whenua, Māori youth, and Pacific youth from the wider Pacific region. In terms of domestically, I think I touched on this before, but a lot of our work is actually education in terms of, we have a lot of youth that are really, really amped with like climate change, environmental justice, and what does that mean? And so like quite often that means like taking a step back and educating them on how, like what this means for us, what does it mean to them and their regions, educating other people locally. We do a lot of policy work. And quite often what comes out of that, what I always come back to is, climate change has become this really big like crisis point to a lot of people, but it's often centered in white, greenwashing, ecocentric conversation. And so I often have to remind people, it's not about being woke to the war, it's about being fortified for the battle. And what I mean by that is we have been fighting forever, we will be fighting forever. We're going to be impacted the most. As Hindu said, like Indigenous peoples make up 6% of the population, yet protect over 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples actually only have roughly about 20% of their lands and their territories, like worldwide. So what does that mean in terms of, gaining their rights back and protecting the little that they actually have? So that's what we work on a lot domestically. Internationally, as Hindu has said, we have been to COP. We've been going to COP since I think our first one was in Marrakesh. And so we work there with the Indigenous Peoples platform, and more often just the Indigenous youth that go there. So we have like a collective of Indigenous youth that are involved in the climate realm internationally. And so our work is building on the joined consensus that we all share. So for example, in America, there's the Run for Salmon, if you guys know about it. So the Winnemem Wintu tribe are trying to look after their rivers and repatriate their salmon. And so the connection between that is their salmon that's in Mount SCEC is also in Aoraki, in bottom of the South Island in New Zealand, and also in Mauna Kea. So we have these three sister mountains that are all intrinsically connected with water. They are the main water sources for the villages, towns, and cities that operate under them. They are the houses of this salmon, which is traditional foods. And how do we as a collective, work on strengthening that bridge? How do we help them? How do they help us? And quite often that means just we have this saying, and it's whakawhanaungatanga. So it's building a connection and acting in relation to. So, everything has a lineage, everything has a genealogy. And how are we actually in relation to the land, to each other? And what does that mean in practical terms? So when working with the international community, we are all shared. We have shared identities, but we also have distinctiveness. So how do we work together with our distinctiveness? And quite often with the Pacific, because we house the largest diaspora, it's acknowledging that, they don't need aid, they need repatriation, they need to be given the resources to help them do what they need to do. And so quite often what happens in the international realm is that you'll have this fund, for example, that, I don't know, Aotearoa or Australia will give a certain amount of money to the Pacific. And when climate change became a thing, they'll be like, oh yes, we'll donate $20 million for climate change. But what actually happens is they're not giving more money for climate change. They're just taking away, for example, $20 million that was previously allocated to education. So, how do we actually get equitable solutions for them? And even us as well, here we've got a really big push for learning our histories properly, acknowledging our land, revitalizing our traditional languages and traditional practices. but often that means like, you know, we'll be at the table, but we have to recognize, you know, we're not chocolate chips to be added to an already baked pie. Our solutions, our science is science, and it's not going to work at your table under your preconceived notions of whatever that means. So I guess that's like connected in both domestic and international, because we have to recognize that while the UN works as a mechanism of unification and of sorting out these issues, there's no real mana or power in these places. You know, they don't serve us. So how do we recognize that? But also recognizing then that, you know, people that go to the UN, they don't have rights to their own lands. Like, we're really lucky, we're on our own whenua, but there's so many Indigenous peoples that due to colonization, wars, etc., they're not allowed at their lands. They've been stripped of their lands and their titles and their ability to be Indigenous on their own land. So how do we help them in recognizing that? And we have to recognize that going to international institutions is often the only place where Indigenous peoples get to talk to their government and actually hold them accountable for things. Like, for example, at the last COP25, you know, we were working on Article 6 and implementing Indigenous and human rights within the carbon counting mechanism. And like, we were speaking to our government, and they, you know, what they say domestically is not what happens abroad. So how do we hold them accountable for, you know, they have this big picture of looking after human rights, of protecting their Indigenous peoples, but yet abroad they don't want to champion Indigenous rights, they don't want to champion human rights. So how do we make them do that, and how do we like make them accountable? So that's quite often what our work involves, like internationally and domestically. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tiana. That talked about various topics, very important, from community building to kind of looking in this lens of the international community in places like the United Nations, and how and if they're really helping Indigenous communities and, you know, equitable resources, all of that. So thank you so much for sharing, Tiana. So next we will be asking a question to Molly. So for Molly, you've published many articles on different journals in the areas of Indigenous traditional knowledge, Indigenous peoples and urbanization, Indigenous peoples education, and militarization of Indigenous peoples' lands. Could you speak to this work and why it is important to document, share, and spread this knowledge?
Thank you very much for the questions, and I think they are very much relevant to the movement building of and organizing of Indigenous peoples. I think one way, one reason of writing is communicating the message from the people and their experiences from what they are going through from each day of their lives. When it comes to education, what they call formal education, and they call this colonialized kind of way of learning, curriculum, or taught in schools, formal education. The traditional Maasai knowledge of education, we call it informal, but it's actually the opposite. See, I mean, it's, you know, education is so much that goes between the relationship as you grow up as a child, between you and the environment, with your parents, with your ancestors. It's a whole education. It's a whole knowledge building. It's a whole interconnectivity between people, place, and also the interconnection about people and what goes through their traditional livelihood. So I choose to write as a way to communicate to people. What is not said can be spoken, can be written, and can also be acted. I've also written plays where people act role plays to communicate what affects their lives and what really holds them to that. Yeah, the other issue about militarization, you realize up to right now, you realize Kenya has a pact or an agreement with British government where 3,000 British soldiers come to Kenya and train all the time. And at one point, young children, young Maasai children, young herders come across small metallic things that are lying on their pasture lands. And it comes to the unexploded ordnance, which have killed and maimed and injured a lot of Maasai. And I kept writing about this up to until one time, the international media approached me. Do you have evidence for this issue? Then yes, I told them, yeah, there's a lot of evidence. And this helped me to build a case, one of the first cases, and I think the only case in Africa where a community decides to take a government to court in their own, we brought this case through we brought the first strategic litigation case against British government, and we won the case. And on the basis of that, of course, they left negligence, they left unexploded ordnance on this. So writing helps to seek solutions. It cuts across the boundaries. What I write in Kenya, it got published through Indigenous Affairs in Denmark, and it get a global kind of dissemination. And that's the reason why I write about. And when it comes to questions about Indigenous peoples movement, Indigenous peoples have come to find to build their own instruments of change, to challenge colonization, to challenge marginalization. So an organization like Impact, and there are so many of these led by other Indigenous leaders, like the organization that Hindu is running. There are so many of them struggling to survive, but unless they are built based on Indigenous traditional knowledge and organizing, it will be possible for them to have a possible change within the community. But you realize that they have become very strong instrument of the democratization, challenging status quo. These are organizations that are mobilized to break grounds so that people's voice can be heard. So writing is a way of transmitting that voice, people's voice, through writing. And to me, it's very important because it's seeking solution through different ways. Speaking for my people, because few of us have gone to school. So that's exactly why I choose to write. But it's not just about writing, it's activism writing. It's a question about writing and also offering and challenging, but also you get people right back to you say, oh, we also have the question about militarization in other parts of the world. And this is how so Indigenous people's organizations are a platform for solidarity for Indigenous people globally. They help us connect from different tribes, from different kind of nations across the world. And then when we meet international conferences, international kind of processes, we become one globe, one community, because all the issues about mining, militarization, about exclusion, issues about colonization, all these things are threads, or we become a mosaic of identity, of Indigenous people's identity, being affected by the same people. So writing is a way of communicating and seeking solutions for the issues that affect Indigenous peoples in my own community. And I feel that it's also a way of actually expressing forms of issues that are hardly written by the mainstream media. And the other reason why much of us has been written by researchers. If you just Google the Maasai, it's one of the most researched communities in Africa. But why should people write about us? We can do it better ourselves. We can remove, we can address the stereotyping of the Maasai. The stereotyping of Indigenous peoples is happening. We can represent ourselves instead of other people objectifying ourselves the way they see the Maasai. So I think to me, it's also about identity, rebuilding that identity that has been damaged by colonization. So these are some of the issues that I write about and speak about and communicate around. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's really powerful to hear about how you use writing in your community to not only give voice and identity to, reclaim that has been taken away, and to just write truth to power, and to really that shows through your answer. So thank you. So we had more questions, and there are a few questions in the Q&A. So we're just going to answer one final one because I think we're in 5 different time zones right now, and some panelists it's like 9 or 10 p.m. So we're going to respect their time and on time. So I'll just read this one question from the audience. So the experience that Hindu outlined at the UN climate conference COP21 in Paris sounded very challenging, both emotionally, physically, and also, as she said, strategic. 1, how have the panelists honed their skills to be strategic in their approaches to negotiation politics? Recommendations for us. And 2, how do they balance the emotional and physical toll that a daily fight can take on a person? And I think that last one is really important, that we can all learn from as well. So would love to hear from any and all of you, and just make sure to keep your answers relatively shorter so we can finish on time. Thank you. Would anyone like to answer first?
I can go first if you like.
Go
yeah, thank you for the questions. This is really a very tough questions, actually. So for the first one, how we are building our strategy or skill. So I think, as I said earlier, you born Indigenous, you born already a fighter. You born an Indigenous, you born already an activist. So it is not just because it is international level that is have to block you. So my strategy personally and the skill that personally I use when I come in front of all those peoples, I mean, they can be ministers, they can be country delegate, they can be whatever, rich or whatever person that when I see them, I don't care because I have just the struggle of my community in my head. So that gives me more strength and that makes me more strategy to talk them directly. So I think if you wanted to talk to someone in the negotiations, don't be shy or don't say this person, maybe it's important or whatever. Think about your own purpose. Think about your own people. That's what I use always. I think about my people who didn't went to school, but who know that I travel very far. I take all the risk and I come there. If I didn't deliver the message, it cannot work. So this is the first, I think, skill that you can have. The skill is not that you went to the school or whatever. You know, I'm speaking English, but I didn't went to the English school at all. I remember when I went to Kenya in 2010 for a meeting there, I do not speak one single word of English. I wanted just to have like hot water in my room because it's too cold for me. I do not know how to pronounce that. I just come down to the reception and saying, water, I know only water. I'm like, water, shh. So that was me. And this is me today that is speaking English and negotiating with those negotiators in English. So you can build your own skill when you have your purpose and when you think it is very relevant. The strategy is you need to focus the people that you have to talk to. In the negotiation, you have developed countries, you have developing countries. Then you have peoples who have different purpose. So like when you wanted to talk to US, it is not the same when you wanted to talk to China. It is not the same when you wanted to talk to African country. So you have to see them and see them interest and turn your strategy through them own interest to make them like hard. If they didn't do it, they're going to hurt them own self and then they can listen to you. So quickly to your second question, how you can balance the emotion and the physical. This is not easy at all. So I can tell you, I think Tiana can tell you how I was in Marrakesh in the COP22 and how I was also in the COP23 and 24. Sometimes you lose your passion. Sometimes you lose your emotion. And I just stand in the tables, I say no, and I start crying. Then I'm saying, like, you know what? You do not think about the real people. You do not think about my peoples that getting the flood, getting the drought, as Lydia said. So you need to be human. You need to think about those people. So sometimes emotion is very helpful in the negotiation. You have just to tell them that you are tired. And you have to remind them your emotion is linked with the real life that they forgot. It is not about the comma or full stop that they're negotiating about it. It is about the human being and life of the people. So put your emotion with your physical world, and that can help you. Don't be ashamed about your emotion. We can cry every time. We can be happy every time. So use that also as a power, because sometimes if you just keep your emotion, you cannot move forward. So that's also one of the strategy I'm doing. I keep my emotion a lot, but when it's break, no, stop. I tell them and I cry, and then I tell them what I have to tell them, and then we move forward.
Thanks, Hindu. Do any of the other panelists want to speak to this question?
I'll go ahead and speak to it. So I think, there's been so many great discussions of particularly amplifying your community's traditional knowledge systems. And that was a big part of me wanting to pursue my PhD, is being able to understand the analytical or settler colonial science practices and being able to braid that in with the knowledge of my own community and our neighboring tribes. And so thinking about specific plants that were selected. And so part of this, when I thought about what I wanted to study in grad school, it was really looking at what are the strengths that my community already has, and how can I use my personal passions to add to that. So my tribal nation we're very rich in tribal lawyers, but we don't have an environmental department. We don't have, I think I may probably be the first in my tribal nation to have a PhD in a settler colonial science practice. We do have some ethnobotanists. So really thinking about how I can add to that skill and work strategically within your nation, and with also looking at other neighboring nations and what are the skills and gaps that we might have. And so in studying mining reclamation, it's interesting because I'm in these meetings that I know no Indigenous person would be in without having this degree and having that power to be in these places and then talk and take this information back to my own community to talk about, do you know this is happening? Is this something that we should be watching for, and being able to work within our nation as well as within the research practice itself. I will also say being in this space has been enabled me within my department, within my institution, to really elevate these conversations and questions of like, why aren't Native people in these conversations? Why aren't we talking about environmental justice and rights of Indigenous data sovereignty? And why am I as a science student not being taught about sovereignty, even though every single acre of land that we're studying and working on is Indigenous Aboriginal titled lands at the minimum, and that Indigenous nations continue to be at the forefront of restoring land systems. So when we look at, both Hindu and Tiana really talked about the global biodiversity initiatives. Well, there's a lot of knowledge within there about Native peoples restoring the ecosystems beyond after colonization has impacted it. So I think those are really important parts of that. The second part, which I really appreciate that second question of how do we balance emotional and physical toll. So I've gone out to sites, and like I said, I'm an avid trail runner. I love being in the Sonoran Desert and collecting traditional foods and just watching our amazing sunsets. And I've gone out to sites where you see really the insane amount of damage that we do to collect these metals. We're 3-mile wide mining pits that go down 1.5 miles deep. And it was like, takes your breath away at how stark that environment is, how much, and being a soil scientist, knowing how long it takes for that soil to develop and form. And for what? And so I think it's really important that we have those processes of care. For me, it has been around running, but also just being with community, just going out and meditating and looking at the plants and understanding them. Those have all been really important practices for me to understand it. And so when I kind of bring us all together, I've been learning my own language as a way to kind of understand how my ancestors thought, because I didn't grow up speaking it. And when I talked to my tribal linguist teacher, like, how do we say scientists in our language? And he's like, well, we don't really have a word for that. Like, tell me what you do. And so I'm like, well, I study the soil, I try to heal it. And so the translation actually ends up being Bawiwa Yata Elia, which translates to earth healing knowledge. And so I think knowing that purpose that I have and the language of my ancestors as I continue to move forward continues to drive me of understanding these really tough days and how it's beyond, so much more beyond me, but for the betterment of my community and of our Sonoran Desert.
Thanks, Lydia.
Yeah, just to add up to what Indu and what Lydia said. I think when living to some of these international processes or meetings, occasionally we bring the blessings of our ancestors. It is a blessing, but also we become one global indigenous community, and it's occasionally we all of us get trained. But I've come to realize the power of our rituals, the power of songs. Sometimes we organize, we dance these rituals, and this has rejuvenating. This has been very powerful for us, and especially it cuts across identities, rituals. I mean, prayers, blessings. This has been very supportive in terms of enabling us to really reconnect with ourselves. In these negotiations, can really get lost into the power of nations, the power of colonial power. See, you get lost into this, but we become mutually supportive. Don't forget that this process started by the indigenous brothers and sisters from America. This struggle started a long time ago, and we also have senior leaders who are supporting. So that's how we've been able to build our things. We always meet people who have been there for about, they have spent half of their life, or even about a considerable proportion of their life in this struggle since getting to the United Nations in the 70s, and they are really supportive. And I think that has been another way of us being able to link the work, the purpose, but also to hold ourselves together, because it can really be frustrating being in a foreign territories where language can be a problem, food is a problem, and occasionally we also some of the brothers and sisters bring in indigenous food, and sharing food from the land has been also a powerful way of reconnecting with ourselves.
Thank you so much, Molly. So I know we're a little bit over time. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else.
I'll just quickly add one thing in remembering like how to look after yourself is remember your why, remember why you're there, and return back to your root, return back to your purpose. And sometimes it might just literally be like, as Hindu says, your emotions are your power, you're the representation for your country, you're the representation for your people. And it's okay to show who you are and what your emotions are, because without it, like who else is going to do that? The stagnant negotiators don't care. Like, you need to show them like why they need to care, and that their tangible like solutions or whatever they're negotiating is going to have a tangible effect on our people and our actual daily livelihoods at home. So I would just say, know your why, know who you are, and remember that you're there for a reason.
Thank you so much, Tiana. Yeah, Molly, Lydia, Hindu, Tiana, like this, having this emotion, when you're doing this work, it's so personal, but it's personal to so many people. And I just really appreciate you, sharing this. So yeah, I will take this back to Jed.
Yeah, thank you again so much. And I really hope that to the audience watching and whoever might be watching the recording, just to remember Indigenous people in, not only in your country, but also globally as well. And it's so important that we're all in this fight together. So to close us out, thank you so much again to all our panelists for their expertise and insight. We really appreciate you all being a part of our conference this year. As I mentioned earlier today, this is our final official event of SCECon 2021, Our World, Our Time, Our Voices, but we still have several more participant-led workshops coming up, including The Spirituality of Zero Waste, a Decolonial Perspective this Saturday from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific time, and Abolition Ecology, Prisons as an Environmental Justice Disaster next Wednesday, the 7th, from 3 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. More information and other event recordings can be found on our Slack workspace and on our website, which will be dropped in the chat below.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone for coming today. We hope you learned something valuable to you. Wishing you a lovely rest of the week, and a huge shout out to partners NASD, SCEC, and SCECon team for all of the work you have put into the event. Thank you so much, everyone. And this concludes our event.